Good morning. This is Don Burke with the Environmental Stewardship Initiative, and I will be your moderator. I want to welcome you to today's webinar on the episodic generation of hazardous waste and the solvent contaminated wipes exclusion rule. Also assisting with this webinar are my coworkers, Angela Barger, manager of the ESI program, and Scott Pfister, the ESI program consultant. We would be remiss if we didn't thank the Waste Reduction Partners and the Land of Sky Regional Council for hosting this training on GoToWebinar. They have been wonderful partners for us as we have shifted so much of our outreach and training to an online format. Terry Albrecht, Section Chief of Waste Reduction Partners, is assisting us today as well. Now, just a few housekeeping items. If you have audio issues and are using the audio through your computer, you can switch to your telephone. Just go to the audio tab in the webinar controls box and click phone. A phone number and code will then be shown for you to use to access the webinar. The call-in information is also in your webinar invite email. To prevent feedback and unintended background noise, all attendees are muted. However, we want you to ask questions and share verbally, so in order to facilitate that, we will ask you to raise your hand when you want to speak. Be sure to mute yourself only through the GoToWebinar software using a little microphone button at the top of the control bar. It will be red when muted and green when live. It should default to muted, and we can unmute you to speak. But to reduce time fumbling through the controls, make sure to not use your phone or computer to mute. If you don't necessarily want to speak, but you still have a question or comment, we encourage you to submit those through the question box anytime. We will share these questions and comments as applicable. For those of you who are not familiar with our program, the Environmental Stewardship Initiative is a voluntary assistance and recognition program. It has been part of DEQ since 2002 and is administered by the Division of Environmental Assistance and Customer Service. We are partially funded by an EPA pollution prevention grant and promote environmental management systems to assist organizations in their efforts to continually improve their environmental footprints. We also encourage and facilitate networking and training events that allow for peer sharing between our members on a wide range of environmental topics. If you are not yet a member and would like more information, please email Angela or I. We would be happy to share more information with you and answer any questions that you might have. Our contact information is on the screen. There is no cost to join, and all we ask is an annual report on the progress made toward your environmental goals. Here's a fun splash screen showing our current membership. We'd love for you to be on this slide in the future. We would like to thank Terry Albrecht and the Waste Reduction Partners for assisting SI staff by providing our outreach today via the GoToWebinar and also their partners, the Land of Sky Regional Council. WRP and the ESI are both part of the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, which has a mission to support pollution prevention strategies and is actively promoting hazardous waste and hazardous materials reductions. Terry's contact information is on the screen. Feel free to reach out to him for more insight to the program. We are very fortunate to be collaborating with NCDEQ's Division of Waste Management's Hazardous Waste section. On the webinar, we have Jenny Patterson, Rose Pruitt, and Andrea Sturmer with us today for the presentations of the episodic generation of hazardous waste and the solvent contaminated wipes exclusion rules. Now, before we get started, we're going to conduct a couple of polls to learn a little more about our audience. We have two polls, and Angela, if you'll present number one. As you may see, the first poll question is, what best describes your organization hazardous waste generation? A large quantity generator, small quantity generator, a very small quantity generator, or not a generator of hazardous waste? And Angela, if you wouldn't mind.
It looks like we have about 36% that are large quantity, 28% that are small, 16% are very small, and then we have about 20% that are not a generator.
Okay, great. I appreciate that, Angela. Let's go on to poll number 2. Let's see this. Which sector best describes your organization?
Well, it looks like most folks have answered, and we have about 80% who are manufacturing or industry, about 15% government, and the remainder are commercial or business.
Fantastic. Again, thank you everybody for joining us today. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Rose Pruitt, Environmental Specialist 2 for the Hazardous Waste section, who will speak on the topic of the episodic generation of hazardous waste. And Rose, you should have control of the screen.
All right, thanks, Don. So episodic generators only been around for a pretty short period of time. And here's my contact information if you have any questions. And we're going to move through this kind of quickly, I hope, but I don't want anybody to stress out over it if you don't have enough time to read the slides, because Don has promised me that he is going to provide those to you after this is over, so that you can have those for reference, because there are probably more in here than we can get to today. And but we'll go ahead and give it a start. So the episodic generator provisions, an optional provision in the Federal Hazardous Waste Generator Improvement Rules. North Carolina adopted it, and it became effective in March 1st of 2018. The key here to the definition of an episodic event is that that an activity or activities planned or unplanned that does not normally occur, resulting in an increase in generation of hazardous waste that exceed the calendar month quality limits for your usual generator's usual category. So if your facility is a small quantity generator and you're kind of zigzagging back and forth between two categories each month for regular production, then probably it's time to move up to a higher category and stay there. This really isn't the provision that you need. This is something for that's going to be a little bit more not a usual operating event for you. So for a planned episodic event, examples from the EPA 8712 instruction booklet, which I do not know if we have a link to in this one, but it will be very useful to you going forward if you should apply for an episodic event, because sometimes RCRA wording is not clear as to what they're looking for, and I'll talk about some of that going forward. But a planned event includes things like tank clean out, short-term construction projects, short-term site remediation, excuse me, equipment maintenance during plant shutdowns, removal of excess chemical inventories, site and production decommissions by a new operator. Those are all examples of things that you can plan for. There we go. All right, so something like excess chemical inventory. If you're deciding to clear out that warehouse full of some stuff that you don't need anymore, you've got plenty of time to plan for that. A tank clean out, likewise. You're not just likely to say one day I need to go clean that tank out. Regular maintenance, that certainly would fit into your scope of things that you can put on the burner in front of you. So an unplanned episodic event, on the other hand, that EPA 8712 provides some examples that include things like production process upsets, product recalls, accidental spills, or acts of nature like tornadoes, hurricanes, or floods. These are both actually are meant to be not that frequent. So if you see these guys at your facility, you may have an unplanned episodic event. And even if it's not a very large amount of a spill, remember that acute hazardous waste will move you into a large quantity generator category with only 100 kilograms. So it may be just a small spill in volume, but a large spill in category. Things like disasters, natural disasters, acts of nature, like floods, fires, and spills are also going to be things that you might consider as unplanned events. You are limited to one episodic event per calendar year. If you can actually have 2 events, but if you petition the hazardous waste section, and we'll get to that part later, but if you had a planned event during that calendar year, then you can only petition for an unplanned episodic event, and vice versa. If you had an unplanned, say, spill, then the only one left available to you for that calendar year is going to be a planned event. And this is, in my experience, the primary reason for application rejection is notification delays. You must notify at least 30 days, calendar days, prior to the beginning your planned episodic event through RCRA info electronically, and within 72 hours after an unplanned episodic event to be approved. And it has to be, your episodic event must be initiated and completed within 60 days, and that's a very strict time frame. If you do not already have an EPA ID number, small quantity generators, you're going to have one. Very small quantity generators sometimes have one, sometimes don't. If you're typically not a generator, it may not apply to you. You may not have one either. And you must meet the conditions specified in that 40 CFR 262 subpart L. This is what that same information looks like in a timeline, because again, this is a primary reason why your episodic event notification may get rejected. So you've got 30 days before it begins. I see a lot of applications come in and it's dated with a start date of the next day. That's an automatic rejection. That doesn't meet that 30-day thing. I've also seen some come in the beginning date that you have to get that waste off site. Say you had a spill or a process upset, is that 72 hours that you did not notify us. Not 60 days later, not 30 days later, but 72 hours after it happens. And we'll talk about some things that might cause you pause for that. So the 60-day limit for the episodic event to get your hazardous waste off-site and disposed of properly starts on the first day of any physical activities. Let's see here, any physical activities that might take place with your episodic event. So whether or not that actually happens on, say, your notification date, let's just say you notified for a start date of June the 1st, but you don't actually start putting that episodic waste into your central accumulation area until 7 days later, it does not move that 60-day start end period back 7 days. You've got 60 days from that first notification date, and that's the date you've got to have it off site. If you don't, then it's going to cause a whole different set of circumstances for you. But that all has to be shipped off site, not most of it, not some of it, but all of it. And for the unplanned event, of course, that's going to happen on the first day the waste is generated, for example, that release or spill. you've got that 72-hour notification period, and then your waste accumulation start date will be the date of the event. So what's not an episodic event? So if you are just increasing production and you've got a subsequent hazardous waste increase because of that, you're not an episodic event. That's when you need to just re-notify at a higher category, because that's your regular generation. So it does not begin, let's just say you had that unplanned event, you've got a spill, you're not sure whether or not, or a process upset, you don't really know whether or not your waste is going to be hazardous or not, but you still need to go through those steps to prepare for it like it was an episodic event. So we want that 72-hour notification, and that event does not start when your sampling results return and show the waste is hazardous. They start the date of the release or of the event. It's an unplanned event, not because you didn't plan to have hazardous waste, but because the event itself is unplanned. And there's a special label that you should affix to any of that type of hazardous waste that you're waiting for analytics for. This is very similar to the one that you would use for any waste that you had on your facility that was waiting for analysis. So you would want to label that episodic hazardous waste pending analysis. If you don't meet the episodic generation conditions in subpart L, then according to the rules, then you will have to be moved up into a higher category, and you will have to meet the full hazardous waste generator requirements for the amount of hazardous waste that were generated. For example, very small quantity generators right now have very few rules, but if you move up to a small or a large, then you're responsible for all that paperwork, those inspections, all the requirements that would typically go with whatever that higher generator category is. And that's if you don't meet the conditions in subpart L. If your facility can't meet the prescribed timeframes for an episodic event, if you fail to notify within the prescribed time frame, or you go over that 60 days, again, you need to notify at that higher generator status, and you will be subject to the higher generator category requirements for that status. Not meeting the prescribed time frames is the #1 reason notifications are rejected, as I said before. Remember, planned events, and I'm just going to hammer this home, notify 30 days prior. You've got 30 days to plan for it. You've got 30 days to notify us. If it's an unplanned event, 72 hours after it starts, and hazardous waste offsite for both planned and unplanned within 60 days of that start date. This is something that I've only seen recently. Some folks, again, we're not going to go over that notification procedure and record info, but there are some slides at the end of this presentation that you will have to help guide you through that notification process. I had somebody notify as a short-term generator and an episodic generator, and when I called them, because I usually call my facilities to find out what they're doing and make sure that this is really what they need, they told me that they never heard a short-term generator and that they thought that it sounded good, so they checked it. So if you don't know, that may not necessarily be the right thing to do. Let's go over some of these requirements when you're, so that you can kind of compare this. Episodic generators, the site is going to have an EPA ID number. You can only, if you don't have one, like you're very small or not a generator, you'll get one during the notification process. If you your site actually does generate hazardous waste at some level, whether it's very small or small quantity generator. So your site is already generating some amount of hazardous waste, which for a short-term generator, those sites don't generate hazardous waste typically. So that's a big difference between the two. The episodic generator can only be used one time a year or twice if you've gotten permission for that second event. And short-term generators, it's a one-time generation event. You may not use it again. You would not be eligible to have short-term generator again for an event that happened 5 years from now, much less than within the next year. The only requirements, and this is really the big difference between episodic and short-term generators. Episodic generators only have to comply with the subpart L requirements, whereas if you, and that pretty much lets you out of a lot of paperwork. If you were, say, a very small quantity moved up to a large quantity generator, you wouldn't have to come up with that contingency plan, training records, all that paperwork that large quantity generators are familiar with. But as a short-term generator, you become it becomes a requirement for you to actually meet all of those generator requirements for whatever waste generator category you're being moved up into. So you don't get that exemption for that. Episodic generators may only have 60 days to complete their vent and remove waste, whereas short-term generators do have 90 days, but that may not be worth it, especially with that paperwork requirement. Don't wait for your analyticals to come back if you're not sure whether your waste is going to be hazardous to apply for that unplanned episodic event, or you'll probably miss your 72-hour window to notify and you'll get rejected. Manage that waste under subpart L, even if you're not sure that it's hazardous waste. Include the labeling, episodic hazardous waste pending analysis, and the date of your upset or that your event began. If it turns out that your waste is not hazardous waste and it's non-haz, then there is a process that we can go through to withdraw that episodic event, so that you might have it still on the shelf for later use when you need it. But you definitely want to go through that, because nobody knows when an unplanned event's going to happen. So the best thing I can tell you about withdrawal from an episodic event is to call your inspector, because you're going to have to do that anyway, and have them guide you through that operation. And again, call your inspector. This is not something that you can do through rec or info, so it's going to require some kind of contact. Now, here's an example of a planned episodic event from Johnson's Auto Body Shop. And his current generator category is a very small quantity generator. He has no EPA ID number. He generates normally about a 55-gallon drum of waste lacquer every 6 months. But he's changing his process. So solvent-based paints are being replaced with new water-based paints that will not be hazardous waste. And he needs to get rid of those old solvent-based paints. And since he can't use them for their intended purpose anymore, they're gonna become hazardous waste. Can he be an episodic generator? Is it an episodic event? Yes, it is. Is it planned or unplanned? In this case, it's planned removal of excess inventory. How much waste is he going to be generating? In this case, he can figure that out. He knows how much he's got on site. So he's got 20 55-gallon drums at 400 pounds per drum. That's about 8,000 pounds of solvent-based paints and acetone lacquers. He has a planned episodic event that will create hazardous waste in excess of the 220 pounds that would keep him in the very small quantity generator category. So now he's going to be not just one category higher, but two. He's going up to 8,000 pounds. He's going to be a large quantity generator. Can the time frames for notification and disposal be met? Yes, as long as he notifies us 30 days in advance and has all that excess inventory removed after the 60-day event. He needs to file in RCRA info, and again, this is online. First time is really terrible if any of you have gone through this procedure before, but once you're in there, it's a real time saver. He's going to get that EPA ID number, and when he gets to the notification section of filling out that form, there is section 13 where you notify as an episodic generator. And again, we won't go through that, but the slides are at the end of the presentation. He's got to comply with all those subpart L requirements. And as a very small quantity generator, those of you who are one know that your requirements for handling hazardous waste are much lower than what they are for smalls and larges. Now, an example of an unplanned episodic event at the good old disaster chemical company, they have a current generators category of small quantity generator. They are manufacturer specialty chemicals. They normally generate about 1,200 pounds a month, which keeps them squarely in the small quantity category. They already have an EPA ID number. They have a disaster with a sulfuric acid spill, about 5,000 gallons lost, can't be recovered. Can they become an episodic generator? Is it an episodic event? Very definitely. Is it planned or unplanned? In this case, you don't plan for disaster, so it's an accidental spill, and that will be an unplanned event. How much waste is going to be generated? You should have some idea of this, so you know how it's going to affect you. 5,000 gallons of sulfuric acid loss translates into about 75,000 pounds of sulfuric acid that will be recovered. They have an unplanned episodic event that will create hazardous waste in excess of that 2,200 pound limit for a small quantity generator in a calendar month, moving them up to a higher category. Can the time frames for notification and disposal be met? Yes, as long as they notify their inspector by phone, email, whatever, within 72 hours of the spill. And this is where you do get a little bit of a leeway. As long as you notify DEQ some way or other of your disaster, they are slightly more lenient about filling out that RCRA info form, as long as it gets done before that 60-day episodic event period for removal is it's contained in there. But don't get that confused with making that phone call or making that email contact so that we know that it's already happened. I got one the other day that came from somebody that had a spill 6 months ago. That one is way beyond rejected. They need to file a notification in RCRA info, and again, like I said, you've got a little bit more leeway to do that. Mark that section 13 that you're notifying of episodic generator, and submit that notification by the end of that unplanned episodic event. And of course, comply with all the subpart L requirements for small quantity generators. And to have an episodic event, again, generators must have an EPA ID number. If your facility doesn't have one, we're going to assign one to you during that notification process. So there used to be something I think called provisional numbers that that some of you may be familiar with, which we do not issue those anymore. Labeling, because RCRA loves to have their labels worded exactly the way we want them labeled. Make sure that your episodic hazardous waste is labeled as episodic hazardous waste to differentiate it from any regular hazardous waste that you may be generating at your facility, because there are record keeping requirements. If there's something going on, your inspector comes by, this would definitely be a violation. If you've got your episodic hazardous waste in with the regular hazardous waste and not identified separately, this could get you into some trouble. Make sure on those labels that you include an indication of the hazards of the contents. There are lots of different ways that can be done, so most of you are going to be familiar with those, and I'm going to click on through them. If you need some more information about labeling, again, these are still in here. You can take a look at those if you're not familiar with them. Different types of hazard indicator labels. If you are using tanks, make sure that they are also properly labeled, and make sure that you include the date the episodic event began. Again, this is going to be the start date for a planned or the actual release date for an unplanned.
Hi, Rose. This is Don.
Yeah.
We've got a few minutes to go for a wrap up, and then we'll field some questions. Thanks.
All right, thank you. So requirements for very small quantity generators in that section had to be specified, since, again, those of you who are very small quantity generators know that there are very few regulations that apply to you, but we want to make sure that you're safe, that your facility is handling that waste properly. So these are just a few of those things that smalls and larges are already familiar with. Small quantity generators, if you just follow the regular requirements for hazardous waste containers, you'll probably be in compliance. I think this is, let's see, small. Oh yeah, these are again those small quantity generator requirements. Very smalls and smalls must comply with hazardous waste manifest provisions. And again, there are paperwork requirements associated with episodic that you need to hang on to for 3 years. So this is going to fall into that area, whether or not you need to use a manifest or not. If your hazardous waste, your episodic hazardous waste doesn't go out in 60 days by your end date, then that remaining waste is counted towards your generator's monthly generation level, which may move you into a different category. Regular hazardous waste and episodic hazardous waste can be shipped off site at the same time, provided you follow the proper rules for each. So again, watch your time. You've only got that 60 days for episodic, not 180 days if you're piling it in with your small quantity generator waste. You should have it separately identified so that you're going to be able to do that. Episodic waste can be shipped off on a separate manifest, but you don't have to. If it's on the same manifest with normal regular hazardous waste, then in box 14 of that manifest, you should note that which part of that waste shipment is episodic, and you're going to have to hang on to that manifest, maybe put it in 2 different places, in with your episodic folder for records, and then maybe say in with your regular manifest for inspection later. Episodic hazardous waste has record keeping requirements. Again, 3 years. Maintain those records for that period of time. A lot of the requirement information that must be maintained comes from the notification. For beginning and end date of the event, print out a copy of the notification and keep it on file. For the manifest, include, you're going to have to keep a copy of that manifest, whether it includes regular hazardous waste too or not, and make sure it's got that designated facility and hazardous waste transporter on there. Fees, we always want money, and this is something that you should be aware of, because fees are generated for the fiscal year. So whatever your category moves you up into, we are going to bill you for that new category. The event itself, though, if you're notifying for an episodic generator event, is granted for calendar years. So it is entirely possible that you might have, say, a planned and an unplanned episodic event a month apart, and we might bill you, because it falls on either side of the fiscal year line, we might bill you twice for fees. So do be aware that can happen. Let's see, drip pads and containment buildings are typically prohibited from accumulating episodic hazardous waste. And that is because those of you with those types of structures, we're not talking about the concrete pad out back or the building where the shed where you keep your central accumulation area. We're talking about special structures that come pre-made with their own set of rules. Those of you might be familiar with subparts W and DD. That applies to those, not to something that everybody has. The purpose of these new rules is to minimize requirements for generators that temporarily exceed their generator status and revert back to their regular category. So again, if you're tiptoeing like a drunken sailor across that line on a regular basis, you need to go ahead and notify to have a higher category and stay there. Calendar year, well, we already talked about the episodic event in the fiscal year billing, so we already covered that. You can combine, and here's something too, you can combine more than one project into the same episodic event. Say you're planning to get rid of some waste, or you've got some product that you need to, or that you need to get rid of, and you also want to clean out some tanks out back. That's something that you can combine into one event. It doesn't have to be, oh, well, we have to do tank clean out this year and something different next year. No, as long as you plan that properly, you can have the same episodic event, just as long as you don't go over that 60-day limit. And let's see, here's some information on how to find your inspector. Here's our inspector map. You might want to figure out which county you're in, and that make those phone calls, because your inspector can guide you through this process. I reject a lot. Almost all of my episodic generators get rejected because they haven't filled the notification out right, or the dates are wrong or something like that. So make the phone call before, and you'll be more successful getting it pushed through. This is the notification information for filling out that record info stuff, which we're not going to go into. So if anybody's got any questions, I think we're going to take a few right now, but
yeah, thank you so much, Rose. That was fantastic. I do think we have a few questions. Scott?
Yep. So the first one, I know that you've touched upon this, but I don't think it hurts to help clarify. So how can a generator address planned and/or unplanned events for a tank cleaning project when that hazardous termination is unknown for the material?
Well, in this case, if you're thinking of if you've got that 30-day lead out time, then here's one of the things that you can do to turn this into a planned event, so it'll be thoroughly covered, and you've got your backup unplanned event in case there's a spill or a disaster later. The event, the physical activities that would initiate the event start date don't necessarily include things like going ahead and taking samples to see whether or not that waste is hazardous waste or not. So go ahead and run some analyticals for that. You may have a bidding process or or you know, just if you're a large, really large corporation with multiple locations, you've got to go through jump through a lot of hoops to get that approved. So all of those types of things are things that you can do prior to the event date. You don't have to wait to start some of those things. It's really more about collecting, accumulating that, you know, those physical activities, which mean that you're actually accumulating that hazardous waste now. Does that answer your question?
I think so. So the next one, and this happens occasionally. So you have a small quantity generator site, and how long does the site need to manage itself as an LQG due to an episodic event before it can return back to SQG or small quantity generator practices? And Rose, you might be muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So those that small quantity generator would have to meet those subpart L requirements. So in lieu of doing everything paperwork wise that a large quantity generator might have to do, the key here is to keeping it within that 60-day episodic event time frame to completely get that that hazardous waste off site. Sometimes that doesn't work, and I think I've had a couple of folks I've talked to on the phone that that when we discussed whether or not they'd be able to meet that 60-day time frame for disposal, they would say, oh, well, no, it's going to take at least 6 months or something to get that hazardous waste accumulated and removed. So at that point, episodic is not the right choice for them. They need to go ahead and re-notify at that higher generator category, take care of that that event, not as episodic, but just as you know, just whatever time frame they've got to do it. They can re-notify at any point after they complete that. As soon as they move back down to their regular generator category, a smaller category, then they can just go back into Record Info and re-notify. But be aware that if that applies to you, not episodic, because here's the big saving grace of episodic is you're not responsible for that large quantity generator or whatever, meeting all of those typical regulations for a large quantity generator. But if you have to notify at a higher generator category for any amount of time, then you are responsible for that. So if your inspector comes by and asks for your contingency plan, then you should probably be prepared to show one that you've had to do. And that, of course, is something that makes the episodic generator, if you can fit it in there and you can comply with those regs, that's definitely the way to go.
Well, thank you so much, Rose. I think that wraps up the questions for now. So now we're going to go on to our next presentation.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Jenny Patterson, the Hazardous Waste Sections Program Consultant, who will speak on the topic of the solvent contaminated wipes exclusion rule. Jenny, I believe you do have control of the screen. And Jenny, I'm going to
Jenny, it
unmute.
looks like you are muted.
Good morning. I was giving you missed the whole presentation. No, I'll start over. I'm joking. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we are.
Okay, excellent. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This next presentation will cover the solvent contaminated wipe exclusion. It's a completely different set of regulations than what Rose just went over. And I've got to commend Rose. That was a great presentation, Rose, and you put so much information into such a short period of time. That was excellent. So thank you to Rose for that excellent episodic generation presentation. And thank you both to Rose and Andrea with the hazardous waste section for their participation with the roundtable. I'm incredibly lucky to work with these amazing women. And Rose or Andrea, if you have anything that you would like to add to this presentation, please feel free to just jump in at any time. Here's my contact information. We are really appreciative of the opportunity to collaborate and partner with the Division of Environmental Assistance and Customer Service on these hazardous material roundtables. So thank you very much for allowing us this opportunity to get information out. So before we get started, I wanted to touch on a topic that I know a lot of people are thinking about, a lot of people have had questions on recently. It involves wipes and chemicals used for disinfecting and cleaning. These wipes and other sanitizing and disinfecting chemicals are being used a lot in response to the COVID-19 cleaning that's being performed at sites. So here's 3 of the top questions we're getting. When disposing of a disinfectant or cleaning chemical, how do I know if it's a hazardous waste? The cleaning chemical I'm using is considered a pesticide. When disposed, is it a hazardous waste? The waste I generated from cleaning is contaminated or suspected to be contaminated with COVID-19. Is it a hazardous waste? And I can answer all 3 of those questions on this one slide. So unfortunately, there's not a single list of disinfectants or cleaning chemicals that may be considered a hazardous waste. That would be great if you could just refer to a list. Unfortunately, it's not there. Just because it's a pesticide waste or a waste contaminated with COVID-19 doesn't automatically make it a hazardous waste. There's more evaluation that needs to be done to it. So additionally, besides the pesticide component, there may be other reasons that the cleaner is considered a hazardous waste when disposed, and it's usually because it's ignitable or corrosive. A waste determination must be performed on any chemical waste that's generated from a site that's something other than a household. And then finally, it's the generator's responsibility to make this waste determination. We're not going to go into the full waste determination today, but for those who are not familiar with what a waste determination is, it's a series of questions to determine whether the waste is subject to the Resource Conservation and Recovery, or RCRA, Subtitle C regulation as a hazardous waste. So a waste is a material that's been used or otherwise served its intended purpose, and for whatever reason it's contaminated or spent, it will no longer be used for its intended purpose. Something to note here is that a solid waste, which is one of the first questions, doesn't define the phase of the waste. So a solid waste can actually be a solid, a liquid, a semi-solid, or a contained gas. This waste determination process is the cornerstone to the hazardous waste program. So it's really important to understand the process. We're not going to go into it any further today due to time, but if you have any questions or would like additional information about this waste determination process, please don't hesitate to contact us. So this is a question that conveniently segues into the solving contaminated wipes portion of the presentation. So one question that we get is, if I'm using a disinfecting wipe for cleaning at my facility, can I manage them under the solving contaminated wipe exclusion? And the answer is maybe, and I'm gonna give you some explanation on the next slides, but something to think about is if the wipe is contaminated only with an ignitable solvent, like isopropyl alcohol that's not listed, consider performing a waste determination and managing it as a non-hazardous waste, especially if there's no free liquid in that wipe. And then the other part of the answer is if it's contaminated with a corrosive cleaner like a bleach wipe, the exclusion will not apply, but it's likely that the wipe after use could be placed in the trash because it's non-hazardous. But like I said, it's likely that waste determination would still need to be done if you're using it anywhere other than a household. So it really comes down to what you're picking up as you're wiping it. So we're going to talk about that in a little more detail as well. So regardless, just a note about wipes in general, regardless of whether they're hazardous, non-hazardous, otherwise, please do not flush these wipes. They are not designed to be flushed. The sewer system is not equipped to handle wipes. It's really expensive in both labor and equipment to fix any clogs. So whatever you do, don't flush the wipe. Okay, so I'm just going to jump right into the solvent contaminated wipes portion about the exclusion. This is an optional provision that was effective in North Carolina in January 2014 and specifically added conditional exclusions for two types of wipes: reusable wipes and disposable wipes. This exclusion, like I mentioned, is optional, which means that a facility has the option on whether or not to manage the solvent contaminated wipes under the exclusion or manage them as a hazardous waste. So at the bottom of this slide, you can see the regulatory information on what the federal rule is and where we adopted it or incorporated it by reference in the state rules. The important thing to note here is this conditional exclusion. What that means, a conditional exclusion provides an exclusion from regulations, but only when the conditions are followed. It's very similar to the episodic generation provision, where there are also conditions that one has to follow in order to be able to have a less stringent management of that type of waste. So in this application, these conditions apply to specific wipes managed in a specific way. If the conditions are not met, the material returns to being a hazardous waste, and all applicable hazardous waste requirements would then apply to that wipe. So if you would like to use the exclusion, it's important to make sure the wipes meet the definition of the solvent contaminated wipe and that the conditions are met. As far as the scope of the exclusion, it applies to reusable wipes. These are typically shop towels or rags that are contaminated with a hazardous solvent and they're sent for laundering. If they meet the conditions, they are not a solid waste. The exclusion also applies to disposable wipes, which are typically along the lines of more like a paper towel or a paper wipe, and that are contaminated with hazardous solvents that are going for disposal. These are not hazardous waste when they have specific conditions that are met. One thing to note here, with reusable wipes that are going to be laundered, if the conditions are followed, after the shop towels are laundered, they do not return, even if they don't return to the site after the laundry, if they go to another site for use, they could still be managed under the exclusion. So we get that question a lot. Okay, so I've got these towels, they're going to be laundered, but they don't come back to me. I get a different set of towels. It can still be managed under the exclusion as long as the conditions are met. Like I mentioned, there are very specific definitions. The definition for a wipe is pretty straightforward. A wipe means a woven or non-woven shop towel, rag, pad, or swab made of wood, pulp, fabric, cotton, polyester blends, or other material. And that's pretty straightforward. PPE, like gloves or aprons, cannot be managed as a wipe, even if it's contaminated with a solvent. So a waste determination must be performed on these other materials that don't meet the definition of a wipe. And certainly you don't want to combine both wipes and PPE in the same container unless you can really show that that PPE is non-hazardous. The definition for a solvent contaminated wipe is where this exclusion gets a little more complicated. A solvent contaminated wipe is a wipe that after use or after cleaning up a spill, it either contains one or more of the F1 through F5 solvents or the corresponding P or U listed solvents. And I'm going to explain that more on the next slide because that one's pretty complicated. The next condition would be that the solvent contaminated wipe exhibits a hazardous characteristic when the characteristic results from a solvent. Good example of that is an MEK, because it exhibits a toxicity characteristic, but that is the result of it actually being a solvent. And the third part of the definition is it exhibits only the hazardous waste characteristic of ignitability due to the presence of one or more solvents that aren't listed. So if it meets any of these or a combination of these, it can be managed as a solvent contaminated wipe. Now I'm going to talk more about this first bullet point because that one's pretty complicated. What that means is wipes containing one or more of the F1 through F5 solvents or corresponding PRU listed solvents. These are the F1 through F5 constituents or the PRU listed solvents that would correspond with it. So if a wipe is contaminated with this material, then, and all the other conditions are met, then it could be managed under the solvent contaminated wipe exclusion. Something to point out here is trichloroethylene wipes would be banned from disposal in a landfill. So anything that's contaminated with trichloroethylene would need to be laundered instead of sent for disposal in a landfill. Wipes that don't qualify for the exclusion, there are plenty of reasons why the wipes wouldn't qualify for the exclusion, and these are the reasons why they wouldn't be eligible. If the wipes contain a listed hazardous waste other than a solvent, like for instance, if you use it to clean up a listed F006 sludge, you then can't manage that wipe under this exclusion. Wipes that exhibit the characteristic of toxicity, corrosivity, reactivity due to non-listed solvents or contaminants other than solvents. So what that means is if that wipe has a corrosive, reactive, or if it picks up metals during the use of that wipe, it would not fall under this exclusion or be eligible for it. And that's what happens with bleach. So the bleach is corrosive, and it would that's why it can't be managed under this exclusion. So with bleach wipes, which I know a lot of folks are using these days, go ahead and make that waste determination on the wipe. And if you have questions about that, you can certainly call your local hazardous waste inspector. And something else, so disposable wipes, again, the trichloroethylene, if it contains trichloroethylene, it cannot go to the landfill. So here's an example question to help with applicability. You have an oil spill and clean it up with an absorbent wipe. Can these wipes be managed under the solvent contaminated wipe exclusion? No, because you're cleaning up an oil spill. So they do not qualify for the exclusion because they are not solely contaminated with a listed or ignitable solvent. So the site must make a determination on whether they're hazardous or not. If they're non-hazardous and they don't have any free flowing oil in them, they could be disposed of as a solid waste. Or you might be able to manage them as an off-specification fuel and burn them for energy recovery, but there would be conditions that would apply with that. So if that's the case and you're interested in possibly doing that as an off-spec fuel, I would definitely call your inspector to make sure you understand the criteria. You might generate wipes with acetone or that are used to clean products before a finish is applied to that product. Can these wipes be managed under the solvent contaminated wipe exclusion? Again, the answer is maybe. So you'd want to evaluate what that wipe might be contaminated with. So if the wipe is only contaminated with acetone and it doesn't pick up any of the metals or other contaminants during use, it could qualify for the exclusion as long as the conditions are met. This slide shows information about the disposal and laundry requirements for both the disposable and reusable wipes. And this is pretty specific. So disposable wipes must go to a municipal solid waste landfill that's regulated under the RCRA Subtitle D, the 40 CFR Part 258 regulations, or it can go to a hazardous waste landfill under RCRA Subtitle C. Disposable wipes alternatively could go to a combustor that's regulated under Section 129 of the Clean Air Act, or to a hazardous waste combustor, industrial furnace, or boiler that's regulated under the hazardous waste requirements under RCRA Subtitle C. Under RCRA Subtitle C. Reusable wipes, on the other hand, need to go to a laundry or dry cleaning facility, and the discharge must have, it must be regulated under sections 301 and 402 or 307 of the Clean Water Act. Something to point out here is this rule, the solvent contaminated wipe exclusion, is more stringent than what DEQ previously enforced for laundered wipes. So in the past, these laundered wipes, because they were used, they were laundered, and they could be reused, they were more product-like than waste-like. But because this rule was more stringent than that policy, it has since been replaced. So reusable wipes not covered under this exclusion must be non-hazardous if they're laundered or dry cleaned. And here are the management requirements. Compared to the definition for solvent contaminated wipe, the management and paperwork requirements are pretty easy to comply with. So solvent contaminated wipes, both the reusable and disposable wipes, they must be accumulated in a non-leaking closed container that's labeled with the words excluded solvent contaminated wipes. The containers must be able to contain a free liquid should they occur, and the wipes must not be on site for more than 180 days. That's 6 months before they're sent for disposal or cleaning. The tracking of this 180 days can be done by marking the container with an accumulation start date or maintaining documents of shipments or an inventory system. So there's some flexibility there. Here's an example of labeling. So the required information is on this container. It states solvent or excluded solvent contaminated wipes. And then there's some additional information that's not required, but is bonus information. It explains how to manage that wipe so there's no free liquid going into the container. Here's a few other examples of container labeling for excluded solvent contaminated wipes. It's very specific. This language has to be on there, excluded solvent contaminated wipes. It doesn't have to be a fancy store-bought label. You can write it in a paint pen, and that would also meet the requirements. There's some facilities, this site on the right has both reusable wipes and disposable wipes, and to make it easier for facility personnel, they color coded them. So the white rags are the reusable ones, the blue rags are disposable ones, and then they have separate containers to put those in. So I don't know of many facilities that choose to manage 2 different waste streams under this exclusion, but if you do, it would be really important to provide training and then to also make it as easy as possible for those wipes to be managed. This one site has color coded to a whole nother level. Not only are the wipes color coded, but the containers are also color coded to help represent which wipe goes in which container once it's been used. There is not specific training requirements that have to be provided under this exclusion. However, even though it's not required, it's going to be really integral to people managing these properly and knowing which container to put them in. So even though it's not required under this exclusion, it's an important component to meeting all the conditions of the exclusion. And the system is only going to be as good as the employees who implement it. So anyway, that's my plug for making sure the employees understand whatever system you do use. So we do see some container labeling issues. The 2 labels here would not be in compliance, would not be eligible for the exclusion. The container on the right, even though those aren't actually used, it's just an indication that if they were used, that container would have to be closed. For both reusable and disposable wipes, there must be no free liquids in the container prior to it being sent for cleaning or disposal. And then any free liquids that are generated from the wipes, they must be managed under the applicable hazardous waste regulations. Here are the record keeping requirements, and they're fairly easy to to meet these requirements, and the paperwork must be maintained for 3 years. The name and address of the laundry, dry cleaner, landfill, or combustor that's being used under the exclusion, documentation of how the 180-day accumulation time limit is being met, description of the process the generator is using to meet the no free liquids condition that actually needs to be written out, and then documentation of the claims the materials are not a solid waste or conditionally exempt, and that's specified under 40 CFR 261.2F. So here's my advice. I think that there's some really important questions to ask as far as wipes use. Some sites don't even realize they're using them. So it's really important to evaluate whether or not wipes are actually being used. And one place to start would be looking at purchasing records. That might be a good sign of whether you're getting laundered towels or other wipes that are used at the site. So evaluate whether the wipes are being used. Do they actually meet the solvent contaminated wipe exclusion? Does it meet the definition of a wipe, and has it been used? And also, does it meet the definition of solvent contaminated wipe by what solvent is actually being used on it? And then evaluate how the wipes are being used if you actually have them on site. If they're picking up any contamination, that we keep them from being eligible for the exclusion. And also, if the solvent's characteristic only for ignitability and it's not listed, you might want to consider maybe just doing a waste determination instead of using the exclusion. So just some thoughts about using wipes. And then additionally, think about laundry. So if you launder on site or send stuff off to a laundry, this doesn't just include your wipes. You want to think about uniforms, rugs, anything that you either launder on site or off site. It's really important, because if it doesn't fall under this exclusion, you have to ensure that it's non-hazardous. So those are really key for laundry. So the excluded solvent contaminated wipes may be laundered or dry cleaned on site or off site, but there must be an appropriate Clean Water Act permit that's associated with this activity. So something to be really careful about. I was doing an inspection, and towards the back of the building, there was this old washing machine. And I said, what are you doing with that? And they laundered their own wipes, and they were contaminated with a metal, and they also were tied into a septic tank. So it created a lot of problems for that site. So just be aware of what is going on at your site associated with laundering. Here's a slide. This exclusion hasn't been adopted by all states. So if you have sites in other states, just be aware that in North Carolina it's adopted, but it might not be adopted in another state. I have a couple of examples. If we need to take other questions, I would be happy to stop now, or I could go through a couple more examples if you'd like to see them.
I do believe you have a couple of questions. Angela, I believe we have a hand raised for Jenny.
Yes, so Alan, I am going to unmute you if you want to speak. You should be unmuted.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay, just a quick question. Do regular paper towels qualify as a wipe?
That's an excellent question. I'm getting a little bit of feedback now. So it's a great question. A regular paper towel can be considered a wipe. It depends on how you're using it. So the next step would be to look at what solvent is being used on it.
Great, thanks, Jenny. If you have a few more slides you want to close up with, feel free. We do have a couple additional, at least one question that goes back to Rose. So feel free to take a few extra minutes if you need so.
Okay, great. I just have a few more slides, and it gives a couple of different renditions of examples. Here's a question. Your facility uses MEK wipes to clean parts. In the process of using the wipe, it becomes contaminated with chrome high enough to exceed a toxicity characteristic leaching procedure, or TCLIP concentration, which would typically cause it to be a hazardous waste. So if the facility wanted to launder the wipes, can the wipes be managed under the solvent contaminated wipe exclusion? The answer is, if they're also characteristic for toxicity due to the metals, they cannot be managed under the solvent contaminated wipe exclusion. So that's why it's key to ensure that it's being evaluated, during use and after use, to see if it becomes contaminated with something that would keep it from being eligible for the exclusion. Additionally, unless the laundry facility is a permitted hazardous waste treatment, storage, and disposal facility, only non-hazardous or excluded solvent contaminated wipes could go to that laundry facility. And here's one that this answers some questions for folks using isopropyl alcohol wipes for disinfecting. A facility is using IPA wipes. When personnel are done with them, it has no free liquid on the wipe. If these wipes are laundered or incinerated, can the facility manage the wipes under the solvent contaminated wipe exclusion? And the answer is the wipes could be managed under the exclusion. However, though, if it doesn't have enough listed solvent on it, it might be easier to make a waste determination on the wipes, maybe. It might be worth it, so you don't have to meet the conditions of the exclusion. If the wipes are not listed and they're not characteristic hazardous waste, they could be managed as a non-hazardous waste. Here's a link to some really good resources. The EPA website has some frequently asked questions, some history, a link to the federal rule, which we have incorporated without any amendments or additions into our state rules. And then also the summary chart. It's an EPA solvent contaminated wipe summary chart, and it's been provided to you as a will be provided to you as a handout. These are some excerpts from the chart. I find it to be a really good resource if you are interested, or if you are managing excluded solvent contaminated wipes at your facility. It's a great tool or reference tool for you to look at. So I am done with my portion of the presentation. I'd be happy to answer questions or throw it back to Rose to answer some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jenny. That was fantastic. Scott, did Rose, it looks like there was a additional question for Rose. Do you see that?
Yes. Yep. So I'll read this one pretty much word for word. It's getting back to clarifying from one of the former questions. So for a site that has tripped into LQG due to an unplanned event, sorry, I'm scrolling back to that. There we go. So can the site return, or when can the site return to managing things as an SQG, small quantity generator, immediately after the episodic waste is removed from the site and DEQ is notified by using the RCRA info?
So yeah, sorry if I didn't answer that too clearly before. So I'm a little confused though whether or not this is a question for somebody who has notified as an episodic generator, because or whether or not they are operating as a large quantity generator, notified as a large quantity generator, and then want to drop back, because they're kind of two different things. With episodic, you're automatically dropping back to your regular category at the end of that 60-day event period. You don't have to make any notifications in RCRA info, because you've got an absolute end date for that. If you are, let's say, maybe because you exceeded that 60 days or because you waited too late to notify, and you've just got to be a regular large quantity generator for some period of time, then yes, as soon as that waste is removed from your site, hazardous waste is removed, then you can go back into record info and re-notify back to your original smaller category. I hope that answered your question.
Rose, this is Andrea. I was going to say the same thing. They might have been confused on whether or not they have to go back in and change the status on an episodic, and you just answered that when you notify as episodic, our department goes back in and changes it after that 60 days. So there's no additional notifications once the episodic is over.
Right.
Can I?
But
Can I refer? We've got a handout. It talks about the type of notification, and it provides a side-by-side comparison of the different types of notifications: episodic, short-term, and then if you can't, for whatever reason, you've got to notify at a higher generator category. That might be useful to the person asking the question. And as far as episodic, you're not actually changing your generator category on the notification form. So your generator category remains small or very small. What changes is section 13, where you notify of the episodic event. So if you're truly having an episodic event that meets the definition, you won't be changing your generator category as part of the notification.
that's a good point. Yeah, Jenny, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's very true. Again, folks that are filling this out for the first time sometimes go into that record info and start clicking boxes that don't necessarily have to or should. And definitely, if you're asking for an episodic generator event, then you don't want to change your generator status. Just that episodic block.
Hey, it's Angela. The requester actually has his hand up, so I'm going to unmute you, David, if you want to provide any clarification on the question. You should be unmuted now.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Well, hey, this is David, and thanks everyone for this session's been very helpful. But just to clarify on this sort of, you have a site that's small quantity generator, you had a mix up, you should have notified for episodic, you missed it. Now you've got a quantity of waste generated in that month, you've tripped large generator status, gave notice through record info that you're large quantity, and then you've got the waste shipped off site. So that the general premise has been, well, you need a contingency plan, you need all the measures in place for large quantity generator during that time frame that you're LQG. So kind of the question is, if you're LQG for a week or 2 months or something, and then you go back in and change your status to small, how long do you need to represent yourself as large for your on-site management? And is the inspector going to come and say, well, I see you're small now, but I still need to see that you had your large quantity contingency plan for that week that you had tripped the threshold mistakenly? So yeah, are you following what I'm describing?
I do, and so again, there's no time frame that if you need to handle that waste as a regular large quantity generator, that you've got to stay one. I advise people, facilities, if there's some chance that you may need that status later in the year, you've already paid the fee. You can certainly keep it for that fiscal year if you want to, but you don't have to. So as soon as that, let's just say you want to get that stuff off site and as quickly as possible, and you can re-notify the next day as a back down to your smaller generator category if you want. You don't have to stay that way for a month. For a day past what you need it to be. Now, as far as, and here's where I have to say, of course, we say go ahead and if you're going to be a large quantity generator, then yes, technically you're required to do that paperwork and have that contingency plan, that kind of thing. But when you re-notify back down to a small, or a very small, or whatever that smaller category is, that doesn't mean I'm necessarily going to come by and go, all right, so I see you were a large for 15 minutes back in December. Let me see your contingency plan. If I see you crossing back and forth over that line a lot, then probably we're going to have the talk. But if I come by the week that you are a large quantity generator, then technically, yes, I may ask for that, for all of that. So, and you would regulations would require that you should provide that. So I can't say whether I will ask for it or not, whether I will even call on your facility at that point in time. But that's just one of the things that you need to consider. If you're pretty sure that I'm on the other side of the state that day, it's only last today, maybe you can take a chance, but technically I can ask for that and expect you to have it, but not after you've re-notified back down to a small or very small. Does that help, David?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you very much. Just, it's a short window out of sight that we put together some materials, and we kind of turned off our status again. And again, it was an unfortunate miss on recognizing a project was going to create hazardous waste, that all of a sudden we got it containerized and we tripped large quantity, and oh boy. So, but thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, and there are some records that might be more valuable to have at that time than others, and that might be inspection records to make sure that those kind of safety issues are covered. Yeah,
sure.
Sorry.
Yep.
Oh, Rose, it's Andrea again, and I'm another inspector as well, and I was just going to agree with Rose that typically when we inspect a site, we are inspecting you at the category at which you are at that time. But I would agree with her, if we're seeing it going back and forth a couple times, then we might be more prone to ask for, because we could ask for that information up to 3 years. But
that's
general, if
right,
it happens
there,
briefly, we're probably not going to be digging for contingency plans. But we definitely want to see weekly inspections and that type of thing, which is required for SQG anyway. So
understood. Okay. Well, thank you very much for your clarifying that point for me.
Okay, David, I'm muting you back. We do have another person with their hand up. Roxanne, I'm going to unmute you. It says that you are self-muted, so you'll have to click the unmute yourself, or we can read your questions from the box, either way. Okay, Scott, I think you need to read her questions.
Sounds good. Okay, so first question is, can you speak to DOT hazmat rules for the transporting of the rags or wipes? I believe, Jenny, that one's going to you.
No, I cannot. It would have to meet the DOT requirements during transportation. I would prefer to defer to DOT to answer that, and I could get some more information. I don't know if I'm certainly not an expert on the shipping side of the wipes, but I would be happy to get more information if we could provide that at a later time.
Hey, I might add one thing to that, because I've is that make sure you're not confusing DOT's hazardous material requirements with RCRA hazardous waste requirements, because those might be different.
Thank you, Rose. That is absolutely true. And with the wipes, if it's following the conditions, these materials would not have to comply with the hazardous waste requirements, but they could. And it sounded like, with the way the question was asked, that there might be other requirements beyond ours that would apply to it. But I will be happy to get some more information on that, or who to contact if there are shipping questions and they need information. Is it okay if I provide that to Angela and Don to distribute?
Yes, indeed.
Thank you very much.
And the second, there might be a good slide or even information in the handout for this, but Jenny, can you just clarify the excluded wipes that are, even if they're put in a dumpster to approve landfill, must they be in a closed container?
Yeah, that one gets a little tricky because a container could be a bag as long as it's not leaking, but a lot of stuff can happen to that bag once it's in the dumpster and it could get punctured. So I think, I don't know, Rose or Andrea, if you have any thoughts or comments, but it can be managed that way. You just want to use some caution. The dumpster itself wouldn't be the container because it's open. It would have to be something inside the container, like a bag.
And you might ask whether or not that's compatible because, you know, some solvents will dissolve plastic. So
that's a good point. And there's also an opportunity to be mixing with some other incompatibles that might be put in the dumpster at the time.
I'm just going to add, this is Andrea. I've also been on the other end where we were the waste management facility receiving rags and dumpsters. And that's something you might want to discuss with your waste management company that's actually receiving those, because I know when we wanted a certain millage size bag, so it was thick enough that it wasn't getting punctured easily. So it was still protecting the workers that ended up with that on their tipping floor and that type of thing. So.
All right, thank you. So we've got probably a couple minutes here for more questions if folks have questions, but I'm going to jump right into probably an easy one here. But so there are some facilities that use, company X to launder, and sometimes they put their own bin on site, and there are a lot of great pictures of people who kind of made their own homemade bins. But the type that have maybe the clean rags on the top, and you put the dirty ones in the bottom to be laundered. Do you have any examples, or can you speak to signage for those types of bins?
So as far as signage, as long as that container is closed and can hold the any free liquids solvent that would come off of the wipe, it would have to have the word somewhere on that container, excluded solvent contaminated wipes. That might not be on the container that's provided from the laundry facility. So I don't know if I've seen any other. I think the way that it's worded is the container itself has to be labeled, so signage would not necessarily meet the criteria for the condition.
Okay, probably a good opportunity to work with your vendor, right?
Absolutely, that's a good time to work with your vendor and also your inspector. We've had several people that want to ensure that they're meeting the criteria. They can take a picture of the container and send it and say, does this meet is this good enough? and the inspector can give a thumbs up or thumbs down, or help with adjusting that labeling if it's not quite right.
Okay. Well, our time's about up. I'd like to give a big thank you to Rose, Jenny, and Andrea for providing both their time and expertise. If you have further questions, feel free to utilize their contact information. And thank you for all the attendees for attending today's webinar and for your feedback. There will be a survey to get your feedback when you exit. Please take a few minutes to complete it, as this helps us improve the SI and to make sure that we are offering information on topics in which you are interested. A reminder, an email will be sent to everyone with the webinar PDF, webinar recording link when that becomes available, but also a PDF file for both of the presentations and the subsequent handouts. Feel free to share with others that you know are interested. Thanks again for attending, everyone, and good health to you all. Have a good day.
Do the panelists have any